I never came to peace. I shut up, but I never came to peace. You know, I shut up for the sake of my parents, and I always kept my mouth shut for the sake of my mother. But all these years, I wanted to know who killed my sister.
The Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office opted not to bring any criminal charges against Father Maskell. I went down to the Baltimore City courthouse several times. I went to the archives. We found not only Maskell, but there was virtually no priest in Baltimore that had been found guilty of sex abuse crimes, despite the Archdiocese list in 02 that had maybe 50 names on it. And when I go through the civil cases that were filed against the priests in the Archdiocese, everyone I can find was either dismissed on the statute of limitations or it was settled by the church with a cash settlement. So there were no findings, no Catholic priest was ever found guilty of abuse there either.
Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. This is Jim Clemente, former New York City prosecutor, retired FBI profiler, and writer-producer on CBS's Criminal Minds. And with me today is...
Laura Richards, former criminal behavioural analyst at New Scotland Yard and founder and director of Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service.
And I am Lisa Zambetti. I am the casting director for Criminal Minds, where Jim Clemente is my colleague. We're at hour 8 of recording our series on the keepers, and I'm sweating, and Jim is punchy. Laura's almost asleep because it's 1 a.m. where she is, so here we go.
Well, I don't know.
It's only 8:30 at night. I'm good, Lisa.
Okay.
How could I fall asleep with present company via Skype? There's no way.
We're a little punchy, guys.
All right, so at least one of us is punchy, Lisa, but the other two are very related in time and place, and we know exactly where we are. I'm here in California with you. Laura's in London, and we're going to be fine.
Okay.
So here we go on episode 6 of The Keepers, a series that has infuriated the three of us over and over again with some of the revelations that were made. And we're now talking about episode 6, The Web. And one of the important things that happens is that we do meet Edgar. Edgar being Uncle Ed, Edgar Davidson, who a woman by the name of Debbie Yan believes that her uncle was implicated by his wife in the death of Sister Cathy.
We see early pictures of Edgar, when he was young back in the day, and he looks like quite the hellraiser. He looks like he's, up to nothing but trouble.
Sort of a Jimmy Dean character in Rebel Without a Cause.
Yeah, I was thinking more like, what's that guy, Edgar G. Robinson?
Okay.
Anyway. But
leave it to Lisa to talk about casting.
Yeah, but when we see him now, talk about casting, he looks like Rip Taylor. And when we see him now, he's got really long, scraggly hair. He looks
homeless,
indigent,
creepy.
Just a little vulnerable and fragile, a little bit to me. What about you, Laura?
I agree with Jim. I mean, he's a bit creepy, and certainly the interview I think is quite interesting because they challenge him, don't they? And this is where the kind of the documentary breaks a little bit in style, where you've got direct questions being asked from, is it actually Ryan White who's asking the questions?
Yes, I believe it is him.
So he's actually asking him, very specific questions. And of course, he's trying to get to the bottom of, I think it was the radio show, wasn't it? In August 1994, the Gerry Turner radio show had a phone in, and a man called in claiming to know who killed Cathy and where Sister Cathy's rosary was. And so the first part is all about questioning Edgar about that, because his niece was the one who actually says, Ed's niece says that she believes it to be her uncle. So that takes Ryan White. Well, he's got a situation here, hasn't he? Because why would he not go and interview and ask those questions?
Right. But still, that interview made me a little uncomfortable. I guess not so much for you guys, but it did. I mean, unless his family was there with Ryan while these questions were happening, I just, something about it, just, I don't know, it bumped me a little bit. I'm not sure that maybe they were, Sorry, a bit of
about his vulnerability.
Yeah, that there maybe
as in him being asked these questions.
Yeah, I mean, he may have been crazy like a fox. He may have been extremely wily and maybe putting on an act, but it did seem a little bit like he was being kind of invaded in his home and, asked these questions and pictures shoved in his face. I mean, I'm glad that he did that, but something just bugged me a little bit. I don't know.
Well,
but he had the right to refuse, of course.
Yeah,
he didn't have to.
Yeah, maybe didn't
and
know
we
what
are
was going on.
talking about a murder investigation here, so I didn't feel like he was being abused, if that's what you're saying, but
No, I wouldn't say that, but just something about it. Unless he's being very cagey and is putting on an act, he seemed very confused and a little frightened, and I don't know. But anyway.
I don't know.
This is my
I don't know. I get it, but the thing is that the whole thing about the rosary, Laura, what did you think? I mean, I know that some people will try to insert themselves into an investigation because they feel like their lives were meaningless and they saw this as an opportunity to get involved in something. Do you think that's what it was when he called in saying he knew where the rosary was? Because he certainly tries to fall back on that later.
Yeah, but that's what he says, isn't it? And I guess, is it somebody who is kind of feeling their life is insignificant, as you say, and therefore trying to assume a bit more importance? And maybe that's what you pick up on a little bit, Lisa, as a sense of vulnerability. I mean, I have a question mark around that. Or is it somebody who does know something? And of course, this is where asking the right questions and having experienced detectives to ask these questions is really important, because I have to say that there are quite a lot of questions that are put to him that are very, what I would say, are very leading questions and kind of answer the question and give him the answer rather than the other way round. You want to ask a question to get information out. You don't want to be giving the information, then asking the question, because for obvious reasons, you've already led somebody and, it becomes a useless process. So I think there were some interesting parts to this interview. I mean, for one, getting to see him, I think because they talked about him and they'd set him up, so we get to see him for the first time. But he does say a lot of it he doesn't really remember. He says that he makes it up. He says he doesn't know Maskell. Again, I don't know the backstory to know whether he even did. And of course, this is again where you would absolutely want to do your research before going to speak to someone, who could potentially be a significant witness, potentially be a suspect. I felt that back part, maybe Ryan White did do all of that, but I certainly didn't get that sense. And I felt he was a little bit out of his depth in terms of the questions that he was asking.
Yeah, for sure. I really felt for the filmmaker at that moment, because he certainly does not, as you say, want to break that style. He's probably used to asking a question and then either Abby or Gemma, they can go on and on and on with an answer, and he doesn't have to really kind of lead them anywhere. But in this case, yeah, you're right. He's out of his depth trying to pull this information out of this gentleman. And definitely if there had been law enforcement there, it probably would have been a better interview. But anyway.
What did you think, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we only are seeing pieces of this interview. Obviously, we didn't see the whole thing, so we don't know how in depth he went or whether he confronted him on any issues that were corroborated or refuted by any research that he did. So I have no idea how in depth he went, but certainly I would have liked to have seen the police department do this interview and have a comprehensive preparation for the interview and then follow up on this interview, because if he did call in and say that he was related to this case, then he does become a suspect and he should have been treated as such. But I don't believe there was any indication that actually happened in this case. An open murder investigation.
Right. I mean, I think there's an interesting point about the ex-wife, because, of course, she makes the disclosure about domestic violence, and it is put to him, is she honest in what she's saying? And he says yes. And, was there blood on your shirt? And he says yes. So, there's definitely more there that should be probed.
Yeah.
More questions to ask, without a doubt, but we just didn't get that depth. And I think that's a missed opportunity, actually.
Yeah, well, hopefully the Baltimore County or City Police Department, whoever has jurisdiction on this right now, will have seen the keepers and follows up with him because, as I said, it's an open murder investigation.
Yeah, I'm sure Abby and Gemma and Ryan White would have loved to have the police there, if only they would take an interest in it.
Hopefully they have a better prosecutor because ADA May was a complete farce. Well, worse than that.
So now we turn to a point that I think all of us have been waiting for. And I know Laura mentioned this in the very, very first episode about, really wanting to hear from Cathy's family. And who knows at what point Marilyn became involved in the documentary. But finally, dramatically, we finally get to meet Marilyn, Cathy's younger sister, in a very emotional meeting. Looks like at her in the hotel lobby with Gemma and Marilyn. What did you think about that scene?
Well, I was really glad to see it finally and, get a real sense of where Cathy's come from and hear from her sister and, see the pictures of them growing up and the fact there was 6 years difference between them. And, I just thought it was just a very moving encounter and it made it all so much more human. Hearing that the mother had kept all these articles for all these years but hadn't really spoken about it, I think says something also about this quiet dignity, and humility about how she was dealing with it and that it wasn't, something that was talked about as much, but, she was keeping track of everything that was happening. And of course, we learned that there wasn't really much of an investigation. So I just felt this real pang of knowing this family sort of trusted in the police and that they were doing everything that they should have been doing. They felt that they were, but there was no real questioning of that and just tracking it via the media, and keeping everything and keeping it in the attic or wherever it was. I just felt very sad about that.
That did seem sad that the mom was clearly clinging to any news story about this case and was following it. Yet Marilyn had no idea that this was even being pursued and thought it was just a done case. It was just a random killing. And that's what the family on the surface accepted. And then to know that the mom really all along in her gut knew that something else had happened. I think that must have been a real shock for Marilyn to find that out.
Right, because Maskell's mentioned for the first time. Is that right? That
Yes.
She becomes aware that there's Maskell and, there's could be a whole history here. So it's a real game changer for her. And obviously her confiding in everything that she felt. Because you never really know how much people discuss things. And sometimes families, they want to protect the other child. And so they don't really talk about it as much because they want the child to, lead a life that is free from the darkness, if you will. But of course, no one truly does because, it touches people in different ways. And so if it becomes a secret, that is even more kind of difficult to deal with, I guess. And we hear about that from Marilyn, don't we?
Yeah, and sometimes family secrets are more tightly kept than even murder secrets and sexual victimization secrets. People have a tendency to want to keep those kinds of things within the family. And of course, the whole aspect of this case where Cathy, to try to protect Jane Doe, confronts Maskell and then mysteriously leaves the school and Maskell remains and then is still in place and in a way that he can use that against Jane Doe over and over and over again and make her feel worse about everything that he's done to her and that she's been through. It's just a terrible, terrible thing. And so I'm sure that when Marilyn kind of got the full scope of all that was going on behind the scenes, it probably dredged up all the horrific things that she went through when Cathy first went missing and then was murdered.
I think it's also interesting here that Marilyn also hears for the first time that Gemma and Abby, who've done all of this work, the police have never spoken to them. And so she gets this sense of, well, hang on, there's some really valuable things that Gemma and Abby have learned, and yet there's no join up with the police. And so she gets the sense that things perhaps haven't been done as thoroughly as what they should have been. But it's a very human part to the story, isn't it? And as you said, families deal with it very differently, and individual people in that family deal with it very differently.
Well, I think we're going to find out some other things about the interactions with the police that are even more disturbing as we go along here. So let's move on to the next aspect of this episode, which was Father Gerry Koob. And this is an interesting aspect of the documentary series. I don't know how you felt, Laura, but I actually was very convinced by Gerry Koob's behavior that he was actually a legitimate guy who was ready to become a priest but fell in love with Sister Cathy and then wanted to leave the priesthood for her, was willing to give that up for her, and so they could be together. And I thought that he came across as a very genuine person that way. What did you think?
I would have to agree with that. I think, from my perspective, he certainly seemed genuine and credible, and he really cared for Sister Cathy. I mean, that's everything that you hear and see in the way that he recounts their relationship seems authentic. And there's nothing that makes me question his behavior or his intent or his credibility. And that night we know that he went to see Easy Rider, but he went to the movies, he had a ticket, he went with somebody else. He did have an alibi. But it sounds to me that he was the person of interest right from the start in terms of the police investigation.
Right. And I think that part of that is normal because when you have a victim who is a low-risk victim who isn't out there in a situation where she is subject to or exposed to many dangers, that usually you look very close in to their circle of friends and so forth. But there is just a very clear sorrow, deep, regretful sorrow in his voice and in his demeanor. And I find it very credible. And what the documentary was trying to play up was his behavior. One, why was he called instead of the police when she doesn't turn up back at her apartment, when she becomes missing? And why didn't they then immediately call the police? And I think that shows a lack of understanding of how things usually go. In reality, most people don't immediately believe that something horrific has happened. They know this person. They know that they're not, irresponsible, and that they would normally come home. But they think that maybe something came up legitimate, and until there's some evidence that there was foul play, they don't necessarily believe that. And in this case, it wasn't until they actually were walking around the property and they found her car basically abandoned and muddy tires and twigs hanging from the steering wheel and all this, the fact that it was parked in a sort of illegally at a catty corner in a driveway, all that kind of stuff. Well, that was information to them that indicated foul play, and therefore they did immediately call the police. So I think his behavior was very normal under the circumstances. I think probably what the detectives suspected or may have had some evidence about was the fact that he had a relationship, apparently, with Sister Cathy. And they may have thought that that was something he wanted to hide because of his priesthood, and therefore maybe that's a motive for killing her. I don't believe that was the case. I don't believe there was any kind of real indication of that. And he would have had to have been a magician to be able to be with her roommate, Sister Cathy's roommate, and materialize the car during the time that they were together. So unless he had somebody with him, and that doesn't make much sense because I believe the car was returned to that location due to the fact that the killer drove to that location to meet Sister Cathy and then drove away in her car and then had to return the car so that he could get his own car back.
Now, there is a passage in Scripture about everything that is in darkness being brought to light. If there were ever any remote possibility that he had been involved in something criminal, I would want that brought to light.
I too, just on a human level, found him very sympathetic and very consistent. And you see footage of him throughout the years of being interviewed, and he just seems very consistent in his sorrow and his story. And even when he meets his wife, one of the first things he tells her is that he's lost somebody very dear to him named Cathy. And so I got in the pit of my stomach, I got a terrible feeling when journalist Tom Nugent starts to kind of float his skepticism of Koob and implies that Detective Harry Bannon says that Nugent, if Father Koob didn't kill her, he knows who did. Because I was like, oh God, no, not him,
Yeah, I just think that's the mistake of an investigator coming up with a theory and then trying to squeeze the facts into it, as opposed to letting the facts say where his investigative efforts should be pointed. I really believe that they got a hold of information about a relationship between Koob and Cathy, and I think that they believed, now they developed the theory that, oh my God, this is why he killed her. Of course, at the time, they had no idea that Father Maskell had been molesting kids in the schools, and that Sister Cathy was trying to prevent that from happening, and she ended up out of the school. I think all those details would have given them another major lead to pull on. And of course, they didn't have the information, and they didn't follow that investigative trail.
And perhaps they didn't clear the ground from under their feet right at the start. I mean, if he was with, was it Peter McEwen? They'd been to see this movie together. It appears that he was never spoken to. He was 85 years of age, and I think Marilyn then calls him up, doesn't she, and checks and finds out, was he with Koob or Gerry Koob, etc. And he basically alibis him and says that they were together. So yes, to be in two places at once and to be able to do all of this, and the fact that he's authentic, it sounds like, in his account. And then, of course, we hear about the love letters, between the two, which, are very moving. There's clearly a relationship. And, of course, there wasn't meant to be one. So, that's a challenge. But I just really got the sense that Cathy did love Gerry, and she was talking about her period coming late.
Oh my gosh, it's so intimate. What did you make of that, Laura? I mean, at this time for a man and woman to be discussing that, I mean, I don't even think my father knew my mother had a period. I mean, I don't think that it was normal for, to have that kind of highly intimate confidence in somebody.
It certainly indicates a very intimate and most likely sexual relationship between the two of them, and not that it was approved of by the church, but seemed very natural and human to me.
Yeah.
And
sure.
They fell in love, and yet they both had made commitments that they had not finalized. And there's a reason why you don't make those commitments until after a certain period of time has passed in those positions of being a nun or a priest. And that is because people are human, and they want to minimize the number of people who make that commitment early and then find out it wasn't for them. And for Father Koob, it wasn't for him because he wanted to be with Sister Cathy. And unfortunately for Sister Cathy, she made the decision to stay with being a nun, and that brought her into the realm of Father Maskell and the horrific crimes that he committed. And in trying to stop those crimes, she may have been killed as a result of it.
And yes, there's clearly an intimate relationship here, and she did say that she wanted to have his children. So there's no doubt that they both felt as strongly about each other. But you're right, it was Cathy that seems to have said to him, we've got a higher mission. She's talking about at that level, their mission and their human design of why they're on the planet. And he seems to accept that. And, I can imagine these are very difficult decisions for them both. But it doesn't talk to motive. There's a challenge here because, of course, they're looking at Gerry because they don't understand this relationship. And I think that's the nub of it, that they don't understand this higher mission that they both seem to have and this level of intimacy. And the focus just seems to be on him rather than keeping an open mind. So whereas with somebody who is low risk, you would look to those relationships around her, but you still have to keep an open mind and go where the evidence takes you. And of course, then we have this disclosure about when Gerry is interviewed by one of the detectives.
Go ahead.
Which, what the fuck? I just had this, as I'm sure you both did, and I was just like, what is going on here? Is this for real?
Yeah, after all of this, consistent interviewing with Gerry Koob, all of a sudden there's this red herring or whatever you want to call it. The
Not
vagina.
A red herring, the vagina being thrown on the table. Her vagina.
What is he talking? What could that be?
What do you mean? I'll tell you what it could be. It could be Baltimore police officers thinking they have the killer in front of them and they're going to shock him into a confession. And this is outrageous police conduct, if it happened, but I believe it happened. I don't believe that he made that up. Why? How? In what universe could a man just create that memory and state this for the world to hear it, knowing
it's so
that
obscure. It's such an obscure thing to say, isn't it? And random. Therefore, it points to veracity.
Well, before you think it's so outrageous, you should know that I've been to the Medical Examiner Museum in New York City, and they have jars of various pieces of people involved in crimes. And there is, I remember it vividly, there is one jar that has a woman's vagina in it because that was involved in how she died. And it's a different world. If they believe there was sexual assault, they might have removed the vagina from her body during the autopsy and kept it. And the police may have taken it from the ME's office to use as a prop to actually get him to confess. And I think it's outrageous. It's inhuman. It's just the worst example of police conduct. But I know, and you've heard of other cases in which the Baltimore police did not actually do the right things in certain cases, and therefore this could be true.
I just anatomically, I did not understand. Was it like a pelvis? The image of it, I don't understand. And why this would be hanging around in the back room. It's
not hanging around the back room. I believe they did it deliberately. They would have had to have gotten it from the ME's office, and they would have had to use it in a way that would try to shock him into a confession. And the thing that makes it real to me is that it would have been wrapped in paper. Because as human tissue, if it was in plastic, it would rot. But paper would allow it to dry out. That's what we used for human and biological materials. We would put them in paper bags. So that's actually makes it more believable to me, rather than showing them it in a plastic bag.
Yeah, these details point to veracity. And because it's just such a random, obscure thing to say, there's been nothing else in his accounts that you would lead you to believe that he's saying this for any other reason than it's the truth. And I think the next part where we hear the police, the senior officer again, I think it's John Barnard, isn't it, talk basically in reaction to hearing this and saying, that didn't happen on my watch. It certainly didn't happen. And I just find that comment as well I really struggled with it because clearly he had no idea what was going on because he wasn't supervising people. He wasn't interested in the investigation. He wasn't asking questions. And quite frankly, he had no fucking idea what was happening.
Right.
So
yeah, he kept saying, oh, we had other things to do. The hell you did. This is a murder investigation. You treated it like she ran away, even though she was a nun, even though she was there every single other night of the entire time that she lived there. They should have, those are red flags. They should have really jumped on it immediately. They didn't until another girl goes missing. That's
Right,
when they
they did
started
nothing.
looking at it. So for the first days, the most critical days in any homicide investigation, they did nothing. And then it was kind of a CYA kind of thing afterwards where he just wanted to make sure that they didn't get basically ridiculed because they weren't doing anything. But it's still clear from the lack of leads that were developed that should have been developed. The car, for example. I mean, that they should have taken every muddy road off the main road in the area and looked. They should have done searches in areas where this clearly indicates that she wasn't taken to a warehouse. She wasn't taken to an abandoned building. She wasn't taken to a railway station or a river or whatever. She was taken to some place that was filled with bushes and brambles and mud, and that's where they should have been looking.
But they weren't, and they weren't proactive on it at all. And he says because they have all these other cases, therefore, how could he possibly understand, what was going on because he was so busy? And so he kind of he contradicts himself. Basically, is incongruent. But I think when we think about Gerry Koob, well, why would he lie? I mean, a lie has to serve a purpose, doesn't it? And what purpose would this serve? I mean, she loved him, he loved her. She wasn't pregnant. There doesn't even appear to be a motive. And why would he make up something so fantastic? I mean, it would just draw further attention to him and put him further under the microscope,
right?
I would suspect. So this part is just such a strange disclosure and revelation, but I can completely believe it because it's so strange.
Yeah, and I know it is actually an accepted police practice to, when you have somebody who is close to the victim or had a relationship with the victim in a murder case, to bring in something like an article of clothing, a ring they wore, a necklace, something. But a body part? A body part? No. A body part, a sexual body? Absolutely not. And so I think these guys were cowboys. I've heard absolutely that kind of reputation for people from that department, and not to disparage all the cops in that department, but if these guys did that's heinous. That's absolutely heinous, and it should never have been done. And it's just an indication of how poor this investigation was.
There are 3 people that were present in Cathy's apartment all night after she disappeared. One of them was Gerry Koob. The other one was Pete McKeon, who was his friend, another priest, who we have not been able to locate or talk to. And the third was Cathy's roommate, Russell Phillips. Russell unfortunately died of cancer, so the information that we have been given about what happened the night that Cathy disappeared really comes in a large part from Gerry Koob.
Sister Cathy's roommate was Sister Russell. And the documentary now turns to sort of raising questions about what she knew and what she knew about Maskell and what was going on with Cathy. I mean, it's pretty obvious that Sister Cathy must have talked to her about what was going on, because the night before Cathy goes missing, Maskell and his sidekick show up and are very irate, and they have a discussion, a heated discussion in their apartment, and Russell and Cathy were there together. So there must be some things that she knew about, but she is a nun, and she is in a subservient position to the priest there, to any priest. And that may have been the thing that kept her quiet.
Yeah, because Sister Russell never actually comes forward and says that Maskell and Magnus visited her, but it's this anonymous student and her boyfriend who have always maintained this. But she definitely has just never volunteered any information about what happened to Cathy. I don't know if she was afraid for her own life or
dedicated to the church.
Yeah, or had been threatened to not say anything. I don't know, but she definitely is a mystery, and a lot of people who knew her just did not know what made her tick, and that, she went to the grave with some secrets.
And the police clearly, said in the documentary that they felt that Russell had the key to unlock the case, which I would certainly agree. But we don't know even what level of questioning. Did they even try and speak to her at that time? It's not clear.
Right. Well, unfortunately, it's a dead end. And unless she wrote her memoirs somewhere and somebody discovers them, or she talked to somebody, confided in somebody, we may never know what she knew. And hopefully, if you're out there listening and you do know something through Sister Russell, it would be great if you came forward and enlightened us so that we can actually help bring justice to Sister Cathy.
And that's a really important call out, actually, Jim, because as we know, with time and distance, people do confide and do share things in other people. So she may well have spoken to other people that were in her life thereafter. So it would be great. I would absolutely just reinforce that if there is someone who Sister Russell did confide in, well, it's really important that they do come forward and say what they found out or what they were told. Could unlock this whole case.
Right.
Yeah. So the through line throughout this entire episode is really Abby and Gemma's exhaustive search just to find some hard material evidence somewhere, some kind of documentation somewhere. And it was just an astonishing lack of anything in the police files. They can't get a hold of the autopsy. They're just kind of blocked at every turn on things that they know should be there, that there's missing exhibits and missing this and that. I don't know how they continued to go on. I mean, it must have been just incredibly frustrating and time-consuming.
What's also frustrating is the fact that they never made an attempt to seize the files of Father Maskell. It was an absolutely relevant and available set of documents and documentary information that they should have looked at. And certainly whoever was running the school must have been aware of this. And again, the principal who, when she found out about the allegations against Father Maskell, gave him 15 minutes to leave. Never called the police, never seized any of his documents, never made any attempt to protect the girls in her school or any other children anywhere else. It's disgusting. It's horrific. It's most likely why Sister Cathy lost her life, and it is not what human beings should do when they hear about children being sexually victimized. It is absolutely not. There is no excuse. There is not a single excuse on the planet for what she did, that principal, and that pisses me off as much as what ADA May did, because she was certainly in a position to do something about it. She was certainly incensed by his behavior. She believed it 100%, yet she did nothing to stop him or to protect future victims.
So, there's no reason for these files to just disappear unless somebody is proactively making them disappear. And then, of course, off the back of this, we learn that there was a letter that was sent to Cathy's sister, believed to be from Cathy. And I find this part quite intriguing. This letter that comes after her death, that she then calls the police. Was she told by her father or mother or, to call the police? And someone comes along, takes the letter, and it seems that it was never entered into evidence. What do you make about that, Jim and Lisa?
It's horrible. It just seems like it's another indication that somebody is trying to cover up for this priest, the sexual victimization that went on here, as opposed to protecting the children that they're charged with protecting. It's outrageous.
I was, though, confused about they referred to it as something being mailed after her death or after her disappearance because the postmark was November 8th and she went missing November 7th. But I was wondering if maybe she had mailed it, but it just didn't get processed until then. I just wasn't sure what they were getting at with that. It was something that had been mailed after her death.
Yeah,
But
yeah, if she put it in a mailbox that night, it wouldn't have been picked up and postmarked till the next day, which is normal. So it could very well be that that letter is what caused her death. In other words, whoever she wrote in that letter about, maybe the one who met her that night, yelled and screamed that other witnesses heard, and then took her in that car, hit her, there was blunt force trauma to her head, took her in her car and brought her out to the woods and killed her. I mean, it's a motive. It's very direct. It's very immediate. And clearly, because that letter was delivered, they know what was on her mind about it. Do you remember what was in that letter, Laura?
Well, no one knows.
nobody knows,
Because the sister, Marilyn, never opened it.
she was told not to open it. She called her father, and her father said, don't open it, don't touch it, give it to the police. I think that somehow she has a picture of the exterior of the envelope, but that's about it. And did you notice this moment when the current detective who's on the cold case right now is told about the letter, and he has to admit that, oh, wait, that we should have that and we don't, what happened to it? And all along he's kind of been defending the Baltimore police that they would never have been involved in a cover-up, that they did everything right, and now you can kind of see him thinking like, oh, shit.
That's documentary proof that something was covered up. And it just makes so much sense, and it would be the final piece that would connect her to her killer, and of course, it's gone. And that's just irreconcilable with justice. It's just not what police departments should be doing. It has nothing to do with law enforcement. It has everything to do with covering up, and there is a huge cover-up. There's a known cover-up going on at this time by the Catholic Church and by people who were members of that church or who respected that church or who were afraid of the backlash from that church.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't just conspiracy theory stuff, is it? This is very clearly deliberate, intentioned. I just would love to know what was in that letter, what was so important, where an officer came out and then it was just disappeared. It, again, is another critical key to solving this case, and yet nobody knows what was in there. I must admit, I guess if it were me and I were the sister, I'd be very curious, and I think if somebody had told me not to open it, if it was addressed to me, I would still open it. But there again, look at my background and yours, Jim. We're always going to have a curious mind, right? But
or at least open it in front of the police, or
Right.
let the police open it in front of her.
They should have. They should have used forensic measures to open it. In other words, they should have had a mask and a hairnet on and used gloves and done it in a lab and all that. But they should have shared that with her. And the fact that they didn't with her dead sister, it's outrageous. Again, on top of outrage on top of outrage on top of outrage with this case. And it kind of brings us to our next point, the next forensic point, is that Jane Doe said that when she was brought by Father Maskell to see Cathy's body, she didn't know she was dead. She saw her on the ground and saw maggots crawling over her face and was wiping the maggots off her face. And they used that information to discredit Jane Doe, saying it's not possible during this time of the year to have maggots. Well, two things happen. One, they find out that the weather would have allowed it to have happened. And two, Werner Spitz says it's in the autopsy report that there were maggots on the body. It absolutely confirms what Jane Doe said, and it makes everything she said more credible. So that is a direct forensic link between Jane Doe, Father Maskell, and the body of Sister Cathy. That's earth-shattering evidence that Father Maskell was involved in her death. It totally gives credibility to everything that Jane Doe said. The allegations against Father Maskell, the allegations against his cohort, the allegations against Father Magnus, everything has more credibility because forensically, they've proven that she was telling the truth about Sister Cathy having maggots on her face.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's finally a bit of good news, and it's all about maggots. What did you think when you saw Dr. Spitz? Did you know he was in this? I think I yelled when I saw him on screen.
Well, Dr. Spitz, a good friend of mine and Laura's, has been involved in almost every major case over the last 60 years. He's done well over 60,000 autopsies and consulted on so many cases. He is the expert in this field. And when he says something with respect to an autopsy, I'm obviously very inclined to believe it because he is the world-renowned expert.
And he did go to the scene, didn't he? In this case, he was the pathologist at the ME office. So, he went to the scene. And as we know, Jim, a picture paints 1,000 words, but going to the scene paints 1,000,000. And, he makes some very clear determinations in this case, doesn't he? Which
back in the day, not like now he's just saying these findings, but this was back then in the original actual autopsy, which I thought was, really important.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a complete game changer. And I think the way that it's sort of drawn out is particularly well done, actually, by the documentarian, and, hearing about things like the weather as well, what the temperature was, and things that just become, that kind of take you there, but also are rooted in science. And because the question's sewn right at the front, or the top of the documentary about whether these maggots, whether it's even possible for them to be there, and that's her recollection. And of course you have, was it Scannell, the officer, the old officer who Gemma goes and speaks to, and he says, absolutely, there were no maggots. Well, I found that a little thing about Scannell, the officer, and that he was very good friends with Maskell.
Surprise, quelle surprise, yes.
So, again, another interesting backstory about, in a small town, well, it's a big city actually, but in a small place, who's connected to whom, over the years, and friendships and loyalties. And of course here, this is a network that we're talking about, but there's concentric circles, and he is the key person that basically says that the maggots weren't present. So,
well, it's just, when you think about the fact that Maskell was chaplain for the police department, for the National Guard, and for the state police, he had his talons well sunk into the police departments there, and they were very protective of him, not only because he was a priest, but because he was a friend, and because he was part of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church is deeply ingrained in the city of Baltimore. And I think that all those things were the perfect storm, and unfortunately these poor child victims were just abused and used and thrown away because of it. And it's a horrible, horrible situation. And I'm so thankful to the people who produced this documentary series, because they're bringing it out, they're letting the truth be known, and they're helping to prevent future generations of victims from being victimized.
And as they say at the end, the truth is here in black and white, and the truth was always there. It was always there. That autopsy was always there that could have corroborated it, but nobody cared about it. Nobody cared to look and bring it forward.
Well, next week we're going to come back with the dramatic conclusion of The Keepers. And there's more to discuss, and obviously the ramifications of what this series presented, and what's happening now with the case and with cases similar to it in Baltimore and across the country and around the world.
So we have so much more to discuss, because 7, there are lots of other revelations as well. But for me, that was a really dramatic end with our friend and colleague, Dr. Werner Spitz, where he is just so, you can see clear, but he shows us the autopsy as well. We see the pictures, we see what happened to her skull. It's so absolutely visually clear what happened. And, as you said, Lisa, the truth was there in black and white. So we're going to get into more of these more revelations in episode 7. So this has been a good episode, and I'm really looking forward to discussing the last part of this. But of course, it's not really a last part, because it's an ongoing and open case. And so this has triggered as you said, Jim, there are other cases that we're going to discuss off the back of it.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for listening to Real Crime Profile.
If you like our podcast, there are a few things that you can do. You can take 2 minutes and go to Apple Podcast and leave us a 5-star review. You can also check out all Real Crime Profile offers and promotion and our sponsors in our show notes. Another thing you can do is go over to Facebook and like our Facebook page. And one last thing is please tell all your friends, family and colleagues about us and spread the Real Crime Profile word. Thank you so much for listening to us. We really appreciate you.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan. Sound engineered by Terrell Parham. Music composed by Simba Tsumba. Logo art by Jim Clemente. Real Crime Profile is produced by XG Productions and distributed by Wondery.
For advice and support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0203 866 4107, or you can go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, safety, shelter or counselling, call Genesis, the 24-hour hotline, 214-946-4357, or go on their website, www.genesisshelter.org, or the Domestic Violence Hotline on 800-799-7233.